Gladys and I were charter members way back there in '89, I think it was, when we started.
We're Don and Sherry Koima. We are charter members of Fairway, and we started coming to Fairway in the spring of 1989 when the church was just starting. We were just moving to Jenison from Northwest Indiana, and we were looking for a new church, or for a church, and we went to all of the other Christian Reformed churches in Jenison, and every place we went was full, and we didn't really find a place that we were feeling at home. Everybody kind of had their own little groups, and it was hard to get going in a new place. We didn't know anybody. And then we heard of this new church starting in the golf course, and we decided to try that.
We are Preston and Mickey Hopkins, charter members of Fairway Christian Reformed Church.
We began to think about becoming Fairway Christian Reformed Church without a name, just maybe another church.
So I was looking through here. I remember we had the group that was part of the feasibility study from Trinity. 8 people.
Was it called the feasibility study, or was it called like a steering committee?
Steering committee, I'm sorry. That's what it was. It was a steering committee. There was 8 people that were on that, all from Trinity. It was Jim DeYoung, Tom Elders, Al Holtrup, remember Al?
I do remember Al.
Ed Koster, Ed Stroman, Norma Tinholt, John Vanderlip, and myself. I remember those were some pretty good times when that group was talking about, should we have a church, where should we start that church?
When Fairway was in the thought process, it was hard as families to think about leaving a church that we'd been a part of for a long time with all our kids. Knowing that if we started a new church, would we have Sunday school? Where would we have it? Who would teach it? Would we have enough people? Who was interested? But the more we talked, near the end of this church school year, we decided to meet in the evenings as a group.
And you remember when we first started, we met at night only.
Yes, I do remember that.
Because we went to, for us, we went to Trinity, other people went to their other places, and then at night we met at the golf course.
Well, a couple of criteria we had. We came from a very small church in Indiana, so not much as far as youth programs. Our kids at the time ranged from first grade through junior and high school. So besides, biblical preaching and vibrant worship and all that, we're looking for a large church with good youth programs for the kids. So how did we end up at Fairway with no building and
No programs.
no programs?
You remember our first service?
I don't.
You don't? You remember where we met?
Oh yes, at the golf course, the
Yep.
banquet hall.
You
I think
remember?
it was called back then.
Yes, it was. And do you remember who preached that first service?
I don't, unless it was Isaac Apel.
Nope. He came later.
Yeah, that's what I think.
And he was a good guy, but the first service we had was in March, and it was a seminarian, Roy Birkenbosch. Remember him?
I do remember.
And you remember? And in this,
He wound up teaching catechism.
he did. He did. Our kids had him. I remember, even without looking at this book, I would have remembered his first sermon.
Really?
Expecting the unexpected. That was a.
That was a good way to
It was very memorable.
start. Yeah.
And then I was reading the religion section in the paper, and that's when we read the article about this new church starting. So, and it mentioned Reverend Isaac A. Paul was the interim pastor. We knew him from back in Indiana, where he was a pastor of a neighboring church, so kind of a tie there. So first we had to find out, okay, where is Fairway Golf Course? We were new to the area, so we had no idea where it is. But anyway, after attending, I think in April is when we started, and I don't know if we went every week following that or if we still visited other churches, but by the time fall rolled around and it was time for Fairway to officially organize.
And then by October, we were ready to become organized as an official denominational Christian Reformed church. And we were then ready to call a pastor. So Pastor Jeff Scheidock became our first pastor, and we met then for, I forget how many years at Bursley.
Then we moved to Bursley School. And one of the cute things that happened at Bursley School, men were given permission to wear shorts to church because it was in the summer and it was so hot and there was no air conditioning.
Met in the gym there.
And we were in the gym. Yeah. But even there, that really became the challenge because we could store nothing at the school.
Remember the setup at the first church?
I think so.
Every time we met, we had to set up all the chairs, set up the kind of portable pulpit.
Oh, yeah.
Remember the nursery?
And the portable nursery.
Remember that?
I do.
That was not a...
This little walk-in closet.
That's exactly right. Yes. Right next to the men's bathroom.
Yes, and the men's and women's, and you could hear each other
Yes.
flush.
That's exactly
That
right.
was less than ideal, but we managed.
And our kids were able to be involved in youth programs in other churches. When Fairway first started, like the Gems and the cadets and so on met with the Trinity groups, and so they could be involved there. And then the older kids went to other churches' youth groups too, that they had more established youth programs. And so it's not like they didn't have any place to go, but there just wasn't a lot going on at Fairway at that time.
How many children? Because our daughter was one of the, Leah was one of the ones.
there's-
There were maybe 3 that were in church school.
I remember
Or children in worship, I guess is what it was, yeah.
if a pastor had a children's message,
Mm-hmm.
he would call the children out and he could hold out 2 fingers.
And they each took one.
Each took one, and that was normally how it went.
The property was in 3 pieces. The DeWinter family owned one piece because it was part of the golf course that they had. That's the parcel that would be the furthest west. The second parcel was the one that we purchased first. And to purchase that, since there was no official church to buy it, there were 5 couples that went and got some money from their banks to put it all together. And then the decision was made to build a church. And so that's when the property was purchased, and a building committee was formed, and we got the church built. When we purchased the property, there was a barn, commonly known as the B.O.B., the Big Old Barn, which had served as the maintenance building for the golf course, which at that time was across the street because 44th Street had cut through there. At one time, that was all one parcel. The building had no cement floor. The windows were covered with plywood. And we looked at possible uses for that barn. We even considered it briefly as a possible church building, but soon found out that even though it was structurally sound, the cost to do that would have been prohibitive.
One of the things that's kind of unique about our decision to build a church, several months prior to this, 13 members of our congregation went to the Dominican Republic to help John Maidendorf, who was our missionary there, to build a church. And people in the Dominican Republic couldn't believe that here people came from the United States to build a church for them when we didn't even have a church building of our own.
In the early years, there was a lot of interesting things happen, but through it, as we look back, we can see God's hand in all of that, particularly in the purchase of the properties, the development of the buildings, and as we look now at what we have as a church, we can see the growth, but we can see God's hand in all of that. Very thankful for Fairway Church, and thankful that I'm still a part of it.
I remember so vividly that first service in that new building. What a marvelous feeling that was, being in our own church, and so thankful to God for bringing us through that, the love that we had as people for each other, the care that we had for each other. To this day, Fairway is so much family for Press and I that we get a little protective and a little defensive when people criticize Fairway, because we know how it began and we know what it took for this church to begin, and that feeling of everybody was needed, everybody was important. When we get bigger, we lose some of that.
Yeah.
But those beginnings where if you wanted to be a member of that church, you
worked.
You worked.
You
didn't
worked.
have just one hat. You probably had several
Yeah.
hats to wear. From volunteering to being the church secretary and piano playing and being the janitors, and all of that was a volunteer thing. And by God's grace, soon our congregation had so many children in it, wonderful little children, that we needed more space. And once again, what we needed space for was for the education for kids.
Classes, yeah.
We needed space for a pastor's study and those kinds of things. And so then building became a new thing again. And wanting a little more room in a kitchen, those things became, once again, a new committee, a new plan. So we came by agreement for those plans, I think,
Pretty good.
pretty
Yep.
pretty easily. And maybe that's unique also, that both the first building and the next addition, there was a lot of agreement on that.
Unanimity. Very much.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
And God's blessed us financially that we've been able to do the things that we've done.
So that's kind of the story. 25 years later, why are we still here?
We're still here because we appreciate the worship that we participate in at Fairway, and the preaching of the word, and the people, the congregation, the community of believers at Fairway. And another thing that has impressed us about Fairway is when there have been difficulties or disagreements, like when their building projects were coming up and everyone didn't always agree at the same time, that we were willing to take a step back and listen to other people and to just take our time and reassess things and then come back when there was a more consensus within the congregation. And that was an important lesson, I thought, as well, to what the people of Fairway were about and their beliefs and how they believed the congregation should work together.